So this is a lecture on smart, healthy cities and the future of urban living, and it's work that I did. It's a conference that I went to about a year ago, and it's just been an accumulation of things that I've been thinking about and working on, and I think you'll notice some of the themes that I talk about it, but perhaps the way I've framed it up is putting the contents in a slightly different point of view. So really the synopsis is that, whether we like it or not, we're stuck with living in cities. And it looks as though that trend isn't going to change. And the population is growing, and we're not going to reduce population anytime soon. We're headed for a much more populous Earth. And but there can also be really, really good places to live. A well-functioning city can be a source of great wealth creation. Indeed, that it is the locus of innovation. It's the locus of civilization. So it is these reasons why it's worth investing in and certainly learning about it. They can also be really horrible and dangerous, and the reality is that they're a focus of poor health, of violence, of bad behavior, of criminal activity, and also sort of filth and grime, pollution. So they concentrate pollution, and they concentrate the good aspects of humanity, but also the bad one. So the real success is how well they're managed. And observing London over the last sort of 30 years that I've lived nearby, and I've seen actually a pretty well managed city, quite open, relatively low levels of violence, quite a cosmopolitan city, and I've just seen the wealth of the whole nation driven by this one very successfully managed city. And there are other cities that are older and more, maybe even better positioned, and more beautiful, but just aren't as well run. They didn't have the vision that the British had in running London. So anyhow, I wanted to put this sort of success story in the context of other cities, and cities which we don't even know the names of yet, but are already bigger than London. So anyhow, we have the advantage now of some quite good statistics. We kind of know, we trust the population figures and democracy in terms of urbanization. We sort of know we know enough to know about where the population growth is going to be. And we're really going to put an emphasis on urban health in this particular discussion. So one of the few successful predictions there have been consistently is on total world population. And it started back in the 50s when we were just between 2 and 3 billion. And so the predictions for population growth have to do with guessing or estimating how many fertile women there are, and then by multiplying that by the fertility rate. And so these, you know the body of people, fertility rate changes, but it doesn't change that dramatically. You know the trend it's working in. So you're able to make really quite good predictions. And the best prediction now is somewhat shy of 11 billion. So we're sitting right here, right at this cusp right here. So this is the lower limit, and this is the upper limit, and this has to do with the ways that these types of things are estimated. So these are the I think the 5% confidence, and these are more like 50, and then the 95% confidence interval. So we can pretty sure that it's going to sit inside this range, and by our past experience, we know that it's going to hit right. So we pretty much know how many people are going to be on Earth by the end of this century. And there's some really great graphics on this one, and I'll show you some of them. So anyhow, you can see from this this map right here, North and South America, North Africa, Europe, Asia subcontinent, China, Japan, so forth. And the red circles are the cities over 10 million. And sorry, 10. Yes, is that right? Yeah, 10 million. And this is 1950.
Yeah.
So there are very few of them. And we can watch as this. Here we go. We can watch as we're moving through the 60s. The cities of Japan are increasing. Europe is growing quite slowly. South America is coming up. We're now in 1990, the Asian subcontinent. This is Cairo, right here. 2010, we're already popping large cities in the first time Sub-Saharan Africa now has mega cities. And we're at 2030, and we see that the actual growth of these megacities in Europe is quite small, but in South America, in Africa, particularly in Asia, and in Southeast Asia. So we're seeing most of the population growth being taken up by these developing areas. So these are sort of the new urbanites. You know, the new city dweller isn't going to be a Parisian. It's going to be someone in Southeast Asia. So we're really at the very beginning of this age of the megacities. And the exact nature of these is really unknown. We haven't had that much experience with them. Really, the only one in Europe now is London, sort of kind of a marginal megacity. It's not even that big. So anyhow, so about 31 of them now, and we're expected more to grow. And I've looked at this already. And the real question is, you know, are there going to be decent places to live? Well, some circumstantial evidence says no.
Yes, but then there's the idea of smart cities, which emerging now. It's winning model by which you have an exact model for the city. Then you test every expansion, future expansion, or every new development that you would do in the future. And then you can analyze and test whether it's going to be successful or not, and healthy.
Indeed, yeah. The smart city, the idea behind the smart city is you can kind of have but you still need to have data to put into the city.
Sure.
And that's really what I'm going to talk about with this healthy city, because disease enters into the city in really unusual ways, in unexpected ways. And in fact, disease, violence, sort of other things, cultural things enter in ways that we hadn't really depicted. And I thought just to give an example, we'll look at tuberculosis. It's a disease that's always been connected with urban life. And it's a disease in Europe that's we don't really pay attention to anymore. It doesn't really exist. And there's been an upsurge in cases in England that's due to urbanization. Actually, it's due to migration. And it's the way that migration, it's not the very nature of migration, but it's actually the way that this particular migration is happening. And it tells us an awful lot about, it tells us, looking at one disease tells us an awful lot about the healthiness, or the prospect of healthiness in other megacities. Because similar things are actually happening as we talk. So TB, just to remind you, it's an infectious disease of the lungs, and it used to kill lots of people in Europe, and there was no way to really clear it out of your lungs. They used to send people up to higher atmospheres, and they would sleep outside and open all the windows at night. It was pretty terrible disease, but there's still around 1.7 billion. There's quite a few people that are latent. Now, they might not exhibit the symptoms of the disease, but they would be carrying it in them, and they might not have a particularly dangerous strain. There are lots of different versions of the disease itself, but it still kills a lot of people. It's 9th in the world, something like that, and something like more than about 1.3 million 2016. It's a clever disease. Clever in the sense that it doesn't kill its host. What it does is it makes its host infectious so that it spreads it around. It's a very thoughtful disease, or a very malicious disease in that sense. And it's quite smart, not quite as smart as we are, but it is. And the reason why it's not quite smart is we have a vaccine now, and not only that, we have a treatment. So if you're infected with the disease, you can get treated. And if you take the vaccine, you can prevent it. We can also test the DNA, not of the host, but of the disease itself. So you can test the strains to find out where the origins are, what the family tree. You can assemble a family tree really cheaply and easily from TB. So you can find out where they're coming from. And this is an interesting thing to know about, is because we figure other diseases are going to follow similar courses. So this isn't the only disease we're going to be worried about. It's one that's been around for a long time. And we think we're going to be able to understand how other diseases are going to infect our urban life if we understand TB a little bit better. It's generally a sign of poor conditions, poor medical standards, very low very unhealthy conditions. So it's constantly connected with poor people. And indeed, the cases that they've dealt with at the hospital, John Radcliffe, have been amongst immigrants, poor, in fact, refugees really have been from poor and unfortunate regions. Now, just to say that we really are done a great job in eliminating it in the West, and by 1950 the disease wasn't heard of. You know, the generation before us had really been impacted by it. However, the new cases aren't going away, so the disease is latent in a large number of populations. And what's happening is that in a transient world, which we anticipate because of climate change, this disease comes to life. And the reason it comes to life is that people end up in transit centers and refugee camps. So people can be quite healthy when they leave their villages or their towns or their cities. They travel a long way, they get worn out, they end up in some wretched resettlement camp or a refugee camp. They're reinfected with multiple strains from different places, which they haven't necessarily built up a resistance to. They might not present the disease immediately. They might get on the boat or the plane going to the next destination in good shape. But eventually they're going to develop the disease, or a certain percentage of the population that they're traveling with will develop the disease. So it's really I guess a precursor of what to expect in the future. A lot of the urban growth is going to be in informal cities. It's the largest growing urban form is the ghetto, the slum, and it's this reason why it's sort of a hotbed of disease. So slums, just in case you're not familiar with them, are characterized by poor food supply, isolation, transport isolation, isolation culturally in other ways, bad health services, bad educational services, poor infrastructure, a lot of disease, kind of violence and crime. And so you're not going to be able to defeat these diseases. You're not going to be able to make a good, healthy urban environment unless you're willing and understanding the ability to tackle this particular, not only this type of urban form, but also how this type of urban form can be made healthier, a little bit better. So cities tend to be health segregations. You can tell how well off, if you see a well-established city that's been sort of fairly consistent for a while, you see quite a bit of diffraction and differentiation within it. So people are taller, they dress better, they're healthier, they live longer. So you can see the cities are a patchwork of health outcomes. and sort of, wealth is definitely connected with health. Cities have a natural tendency to actually segregate. And a lot of that is just the economic influences, cultural things as well. So this is a rather famous map, and this map led to a change in legislation in the United States in the 1960s, the Fair Housing Act it's called. And this is my city, this is Philadelphia. In fact, my neighborhood my street is on here somewhere. So it's around here. So this was in an immigrant neighborhood. This was an elite, if you had produced this map today, it would be considered illegal. But these different color codings were the ethnicity of the people living there and the level of depravity. So I can say, so the green one are Italians, blue are Jewish, the pink are colored people, African Americans, and the letters and numbers there over here. These are factories. I think they labeled them as these red sections were commercial. There was light industry in the city at that time. It's all gone now. Now this seems an innocent enough map. You know, it's nice to know who your neighbors are. But actually, these maps were used by the financing companies to fund mortgages. So it would be almost impossible to buy a house in one of these areas. This was all growing up. This was all a black neighborhood, and the Irish. So these were the Italians living here. This was kind of a mixed area, mostly Jewish. So it was almost impossible to finance and get funding for a house if you were part of an undesirable group. And what ended up happening was it further segregated these groups from each other. It was a line down Bainbridge Street. I think it's right here. You know, you just cross over it and there'd be a different ethnicity. You know, it's all mixed up now. It's all thankfully it's all been gentrified in quite a much better manner than it is now. But still, that was a fact of things to come. So cities tend to be. So this area right here is really rather famous because during the 60s and 70s, it was the site of gangland violence with the mafia. They've just released a new film about it called I think it's called The Irishman. But it's really about kind of a subculture of violence and criminality that existed in certain parts of the city. But I just wanted to show you this. This is redlining, and it changed. They realized that it was not particularly good for the country, so they introduced the Fair Housing Act. But I'm afraid that it's the fact that they've outlawed it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Neighborhoods can become segregated, and it's certainly the case with developing cities, is they tend to be highly segregated. And the other thing that happens is, if with segregation comes urban sprawl, you want to spread out, you want to move away from undesirable areas. And that in itself causes problems. It's actually the long commutes and the poor transport infrastructure, the dangerous transport infrastructure that's killing people. And you end up these are taken from Philadelphia. You end up with these disposable cities that were once quite thriving. This is a movie theater, now it's a church. This is on a place called Girard Avenue, which was once a very active commercial, quite a beautiful street, but it ends up being pretty trash. And it was predicted by this Jane Jacobs, who wrote about this death and life of the American city. And yeah, it's great. Well, she basically wrote a book about Philadelphia. And if you go there, you can still see some of these things. And this is Girard Avenue. You can just see these are. I mean, it's a step above a slum. And actually, I have friends living around here, and it's not so bad. But these are these gracious townhouse. So a fairly successful merchant family would have lived in this house. Now it's been divided up into flats, and it's quite decaying. A house between these two have been knocked down. There's a mural program to try and brighten up the city. But these are quite elegant. These are lining, this is like 10th Street or something in Girard. And well, you can just see this guy chased after me. I took a picture and he didn't like the fact, not this guy, but the guy with the red shirt started chasing after me when he saw that I was taking his picture. So anyhow, you don't, just because you're rich doesn't mean you're healthy. And indeed, health outcomes, even in sophisticated cities like Philadelphia, is an incredibly rich city. And it's been the generator of wealth for centuries. It's always been a place to go to make packets of money. And certainly some people are benefiting, but there's a lot of new immigrants, and some people, cultural reasons, they just don't have very good expectations. So in most cases, America's absolutely rubbish in terms of providing reasonable care to its citizens. So it is just an absolutely shocking reality that our life expectation, American life expectation, is less than everyone else's. Unfortunately, it seems to be hitting women. I've already mentioned segregated groups. Rich people living over 70, best place in the world. If you made it to 70 and you have money in the bank, you can live forever. And usually you live long enough until your money runs out, and then mysteriously you die at age 90, 95, flat broke. And this is quite a common story in the United States. Quite wealthy people have been driven into poverty in old age because of the health costs, and their kids, these are people who grew up in quite wealthy surroundings, end up leaving nothing to their children. Anyhow, I wanted just to comment that globalization is actually working against us. So it's actually working towards a more segregated city. And indeed, it's making some cities exemplary and rich, while other cities, which are not globalized, quite poor. And I think this has to do with the very nature of globalization, and it's something that the politicians neglected to tell us when we went about encouraging global trade, is that the globally competitive cities tend to get extremely rich, while nearby cities which aren't globally competitive, they tend to, so the globally competitive cities would compete on a global stage, but the medium competitive cities, the metal bashers and the ones who are in manufacturing, they're competing with metal bashing and manufacturing on a global scale, and they don't compete very well. Whereas the entrepreneurs and the business people, the financiers, living in the competitive cities. So you end up getting this big gap between north and south. In the States, there's quite a narrow line in the east of very prosperous cities. If you drive an hour to the west, hour and a half to the west, there's another line of cities which were prosperous during the Industrial Revolution, and they've fallen on terrible times. And then if you go to the Rust Belt, it gets even worse. So regions tend to compete with each other, and this further adds to this sort of segregation, to fracture the city. And then lots of sort of leftover places. And traveling in, you can go up to sort of cities in the Midlands that have not fared very well, ex-manufacturing. Sheffield was a famous one, although it seems to have bounced out. Wolverhampton was once a fabulously wealthy place. And it's fallen on tough times. But anyhow, the advantages they offer are far outweighed. It's just resolving these problems are something that takes a certain amount of concentration and no lack of will and government support. And the segregation of labor, as I've just discussed, is actually beneficial. It's something that you actually want. But And the attractions of working at it are really quite extraordinary. And cities really bring about sort of really, really quite fabulous outgrowth of culture. And this is just one example. Right. Yeah, I think so. This this picture encapsulates a lot of these concepts all in one. This is the Kimmelsettel, which is this gigantic sort of palace of culture in the middle of the city. These are mummers, which is an ethnic kind of parade that's done every year on New Year's. This is New Year's Day. This is the City Hall of Philadelphia, which was the first American building that was the tallest in the world. So the building that was the tallest in the world before this, I think, was the cathedral in Stuttgart. And after this building was the tallest building in the world for 5 or 6 years or 10 years. And then for the next 100 years, all of the new tallest buildings were built in America. And that ended in 2003, I think, something like that. And now all of the new tallest buildings in the world are outside of the United States. But this is anyhow a shift. This is the University of the Arts, so this is an art college. So it just shows you sort of a rich cultural sort of, this is how people are making their money now in the city, through culture. So cities evolve over the years, and things like garden cities seemed like a nice concept. They had hidden, and leading up to the smart city concept. I'm sort of building up to that. So anyhow, the whole garden city concept was you segregate living in industrial spaces. You improve the public transport so that people don't need to work in the dirty bits of the city. They can live in cleaner, grassier areas. You include a lot of green space to absorb the pollution and to make them better living. And so this concept has actually been worked. And much of the American suburban development was inspired by the garden cities in England. You know, they're all, Pasadena was built after the developers stopped in England on the way back from the war in Europe. So a lot of this stuff comes out of British urban design. But it has its two swords. This is another city that I've written about quite extensively. This is Naples. And you can see the modernization by these. It's an old city. It's one of the first cities actually laid out with an urban design. This main street here was laid out half a millennium before the Common Era. And every city that you see every road that you see that's a little bit wider than the rest, this road led to Pompeii, and it was the only diagonal road in the whole city. And that was cut at a later date as the Roman world took over the Greek. So every road that you see was an attempt to open up the city, became very congested. So this was 1905, this development. This is Via Roma right here. No, this is Via Roma right here. So this was called Piazza Dante. So this was cut in the 16th century. This is Via Duomo. That was cut later on. So these roads were cut in. So anyhow, every new generation thought to open up the city a little bit. And as a result, the city became segregated. So the rich people tend to live around these wide boulevards, these widened streets, where there's better air, and the poor people tend to be clustered in these back streets, the vicoli. And much of this was brought on by this quirky ideas about miasma, the idea that you would get sick through the air. So the way to be healthy was to have fresh air. I mean, they were right about that, but they didn't understand the transmission of disease very well. But it did shape the city quite effectively, and it led to actually an urban development which you can recognize and spot today. And again, this sort of model of a healthy city was the one that sort of drove the development of Naples, but it also, this garden city. So this sort of model by Barton and Grant, you must have come across. The idea behind you have sort of the core people, then you have their lifestyle, community that they live in, the local economy which controls their sort of daily life, their activities, the built environment, the natural environment. So connecting in itself with this global. So this idea that you have this entity, that you're modeling a larger scale thing is really quite good. And of course it led to, this was some of the original work of the healthy city movement, Ebenezer Hazard, in the end of the 19th century. Of course the smart city concept is sort of another version of this. And the idea behind that is that the city is designed from the data up, so that it's functioning entirely based on the flow of the flux of knowledge and information. And you have some really rather colorful things. You have these automated transport systems running underground. You have a autonomous public transport system based around a dominant mode of sort of healthy transport, walking, really wide sidewalks, and a lot of green in the city. So the ugly stuff gets buried underground. And of course, every footstep, every movement of these things is managed as part of a central data management system. And this concept of a smart city is such that you can put on buses to areas if there's an event, automatically, if they can detect if there's an overloading of people in one section. They have automatic health or sensors. Maybe it tests your temperature as you're walking by on the street, and it'll alert, send you a text message, does facial recognition